to Cause Before Symptom, uncovering the real cabal and spiritual forces that are controlling the world. And now, here is your host, James Carner.
Welcome to Cause Before Symptom. I'm your host, James Carner. Today is May 9th, 2026, and tonight's episode is all about the UFO age, how uncertainty became a system of control. Yeah, you're not going to believe this. Yesterday, War.gov, the website, released /UFO, and they promised documents that the Trump administration have been touting for years. And it's legit, it's real. I downloaded everything I could on it. I downloaded about half of all of the classified or now declassified files, and I started going through them. And what I find that's really interesting is not the UFOs or aliens themselves, but something deeper that's going on that nobody is addressing. And for nearly 80 years, the UFO phenomenon has existed between belief and ridicule. I remember 20 years ago, I would be ridiculed over saying that aliens are real. And people, James, just like when I was telling people, look at all these lines of the skies. How come today there's lines, but yesterday there wasn't? James, you're such a crazy conspiracy theorist. Well, governments investigated it. Intelligence agencies classified it. Newspapers sensationalized it. Civilian organization mythologized it. And entire generations became trapped in a cycle of fascination, fear, and speculation. But after examining military memorandums, FBI archives, Air Force intelligence procedures, nuclear infrastructure reports, psychological warfare studies, civilian UFO organizations, and strategic defense analysis, well, a very different picture begins to emerge. Remember, guys, I have all kinds of books, 30,000 books. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them are just about UFOs, and also declassified information I could find on this phenomenon. Now, the real story may not be extraterrestrials at all. The real story may be how unresolved uncertainty transformed modern civilization itself. Let me repeat that. The real story may be how unresolved uncertainty transformed modern civilization itself. This investigation follows a UFO phenomenon from the opening years of the atomic age through the Cold War and into the modern information era. The archives that I have and all of the information that I downloaded off of the War.gov /UFO website where am I? The archives reveal that governments encountered reoccurring unexplained aerial phenomena during a period of intense geopolitical fear, technological acceleration, and nuclear vulnerability. The response was not simple confirmation or dismissal. Instead, military and intelligence agencies built systems to manage uncertainty itself. Radar integration programs, witness credibility frameworks, interagency reporting systems, secrecy protocols, and psychological management strategies designed to reduce panic and maintain institutional stability during a time when the skies suddenly appeared, well, unpredictable. Well, the deeper the investigation goes, the clearer another pattern becomes. The strongest UFO cases were rarely tabloid stories alone. The most difficult incidents often involved pilots, radar operators, police officers, military personnel, nuclear facilities, missile sites, and multi-witness events with physical traces or instrumentation. Yet, despite decades of investigations, the archives still do not provide direct proof of extraterrestrial visitation. What they do reveal is something equally important. Secrecy amplified distrust, Media amplified mythology, and civilian organizations transformed unresolved observations into a massive cultural belief system that eventually became larger than the sightings themselves. And as the decades progressed, the UFO phenomenon evolved beyond aerial observations and entered religion, politics, psychology, entertainment, and anti-establishment culture. Contactee movements blended UFOs with cosmic salvation, hidden wisdom, and spiritual transformation. Civilian UFO groups accused governments of concealment. Intelligence agencies worried about panic, social contagion, and information overload. The mystery became a mirror reflecting civilization's deepest fears about hidden power, technological change, nuclear annihilation, and institutional deception. What began as unexplained objects in the sky evolved into one of the most powerful modern mythologies in human history. This show argues that the UFO era may have been the prototype for the modern information age itself. The same forces visible throughout the archives now dominate society. Incomplete information, emotional amplification, media contagion, institutional distrust, psychological manipulation, and population struggling to separate reality from narrative. Do you understand what I'm saying here, folks? What I'm saying is, everything that's going on right now in society, it was all a test through the UFO phenomena. And it worked. It got us all messed up in the head. The danger may not be aliens. The real danger may be what happens when fear, secrecy, technology, and uncertainty combine inside a civilization no longer capable of determining what is true. Rather than chasing sensational claims, this investigation follows the historical evidence step by step through military archives, psychological operations, civilian UFO culture, and strategic defense analysis to uncover how the UFO phenomenon became far more than a mystery in the sky. It became a system through which modern civilization learned to live under permanent uncertainty. I'm excited about this. It's a long show. I'm going to have to skip breaking news. Shout out to everybody on the live chat rumble. Number one warrior is Noel. Noel stating, good evening, good morning. Hello all. It's nice to have a place to hear truth and hang with some good people. Thankful for you all. We're thankful for you. And that was very sweet of you. Thank you. And I think we all agree with you too as well, Noel. Number two warrior is Boots Hafner, the Sparkman Spleefer himself, the powder keg maniac, the dude in the closet smoking a spleef, just getting high on life. This is the Boots Hafner man himself. He says, hello everyone. All right. Let's all help out our host and hit that thumbs up button. Don't forget to tell a friend about James's award-winning detox formula, ElitePotion.com. Yes, ElitePotion.com. Get rid of parasites and heavy metals. I believe parasites are strongly linked with demonic activity, and I believe that once you remove heavy metals and parasites, you're not going to have as many nightmares. That's just me. Yeah, and all of you can do me a favor. Hey, follow my thumb right now if you can, please, because I'm telling you, this is the most important part of the show. We've got to get Rumble to get us up in the ranks, and they won't. And the only way to do it is follow my thumb down to my phone or your phone, hit the X button, hit thumbs up, and then hit live chat, and believe me, I'll be a lot happier. Number four warrior is Philip Del Piano saying, good evening, everyone. He says, they are real. Had UFO follow me and my buddy back in the early 80s. Pine Bush, New York area. Lit the road up late at night. Says, James, read everything about the Pine Bush UFO. Sightings 80s, 90s was big. Could have been re-engineered by us out of Stewart Air Force Base, Newburgh, New York. What do you think about the possibility that we created by the aliens of the UFOs of our gods or spleef time? Well, I think that it's all man-made, and we have a deal with the fallen angels to get this type of technology so that they can take over the world and we worship them. That's what I think the whole UFO agenda is. I don't think that it's about mankind traveling outside of our planet. That's just my opinion. All right, guys, let's get into the dirty dirt. For almost 80 years, humanity has stared into the sky, searching for answers. Some saw lights, which I've done. I've seen many UFOs. You name it. Tic Tacs, real disc metal with lights all the way around. I've seen all kinds, little orbs, red, yellow, green, blue, purple, all of the, and even horseshoes from Lucky Charms. I've seen it. I've seen so many. Some saw visitors, little aliens. Some saw deception somewhere between government secrecy, military investigation, psychological warfare, media sensationalism, civilian obsession, and spiritual speculation. The UFO phenomenon became one of the most powerful modern mythologies ever created. Now, let me take a stop back here and pause. I think you all were expecting me to go mining. Well, something in my spirit said don't. I don't know what it was, but something was telling me just stay at home for a while. So that's what I'm doing. Maybe earlier this coming week I will, but for now I'm sticking around, so you're stuck with this ugly mug. Back to aliens. Tonight is not about proving aliens, okay? I could care less about those things. Tonight is about something much bigger. After examining military archives, FBI files, Air Force intelligence memorandums, radar investigations, nuclear infrastructure reports, psychological studies, civilian UFO organizations, and strategic defense analysis, one conclusion keeps resurfacing over and over and over again. The real story may not be what is in the sky. The real story may be what uncertainty does to civilization itself. Meaning, I can't prove it, but I think the UFO phenomenon and all of that crap is a psychological warfare game against the people of the world. Well, that changes the entire conversation, doesn't it? When the modern UFO era exploded in 1947, the world had just survived the most destructive war in human history. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had introduced the atomic age, and radar systems were transforming warfare. Captured Nazi rocket scientists like Wernher von Braun were being absorbed into American military programs. The Cold War was beginning, and nations were terrified of surprise attacks or espionage or technological breakthroughs and weapons beyond public understanding. Well, that was the atmosphere in which the UFO phenomenon was born. The deeper these archives are examined, and I have a lot of information, the clearer one thing becomes. Governments did take the subject seriously. The military created investigative procedures. Intelligence agencies coordinated reporting systems. Radar operators tracked anomalies. Pilots were interviewed. Police officers documented incidences. Nuclear sites repeatedly appeared in the files. Strategic defense officials worried about airspace vulnerability and public panic. But what the archives do not show is just as important. They do not show a clean extraterrestrial disclosure story. They do not show governments confidently announcing that alien craft were visiting Earth. Not even what Trump put out and all of the War.org/UFO crap. None of that says they exist. It's just a bunch of shit that we've already seen already. So they didn't release anything new. Sorry. So what they reveal instead is something far more complicated. Institutions struggling to manage ambiguity during one of the most unstable technological transitions in modern history. And that ambiguity changed everything. Military systems feared false positives. Intelligence agencies feared information overload. Governments feared panic. The public feared secrecy. The media feared being left behind. Civilian researchers feared cover-ups. Ordinary people increasingly believed hidden forces were operating above their awareness. And out of that fear, a mythology began to grow. The UFO phenomenon slowly transformed from isolated sightings into something much larger. A cultural operating system, a spiritual framework, a political symbol, a technological prophecy, and eventually a mirror reflecting civilization's deepest anxieties. I think it was on purpose, but I can't prove it. People began pouring meaning into the mystery meaning, right? Fear of nuclear annihilation. Remember when we were all in the 80s and we were all told to get under our desks and say, don't look at the light? Yeah, that's going to help. Fear of nuclear annihilation, fear of hidden technology, fear of manipulation, fear of losing control, fear that institutions were no longer telling the truth. How does that happen? Well, at the same time, others poured hope into it. Hope for transcendence, hope for salvation, with Jesus, hope for higher intelligence, hope for hidden breakthroughs, hope that humanity was not alone. Well, the phenomenon became larger than the evidence itself. That may be the single most important discovery in this entire investigation. Nobody's talking about this, okay? The evidence, the phenomenon, the evidence is, well, the phenomenon became larger than the evidence itself. It all of a sudden took off. Now, because the same mechanisms visible throughout the UFO era now dominate modern civilization. Today, we live inside a world of algorithmic amplification, deepfakes, AI uncertainty, information warfare, psychological operations, media fragmentation, institutional distrust, and populations struggling to determine what is real. The UFO age may not have been an isolated phenomenon at all. It may have been the rehearsal for the modern information age itself. So tonight, this investigation is not going to chase sensationalism. It's going to build a conclusion first and search for evidence afterward. Oh, it's not. It's not going to build a conclusion first and then search for evidence afterward. It's going to walk carefully through the historical record and examine what the archives actually support, where the evidence ends, where mythology begins, and how unresolved uncertainty evolved into one of the most influential psychological and cultural systems of the modern era. Because in the end, the greatest question may not be whether something was in the sky. The greatest question may be what happens to a civilization when uncertainty itself becomes permanent. Ouch.
We are being lied to about our sovereignty, about our health, about birth, and about what's actually best for our families. And most women don't even realize it until they're already in the system. Hi, my name is Lisa, the Sovereign Woman. I'm going live every single day for 31 days at 8 p.m. Eastern, Monday through Friday on YouTube and TikTok. This is for the woman who knows there has to be another way. A way to give birth without fear, without being controlled, without giving up her authority. Inside these lives, I'm teaching you how to surrender to God, trust your body, and step into a truly sovereign and fearless birth. Not from hype, not from rebellion, but from truth. So if you feel that pull, like something isn't right, like you were made for more than what you've been told, come join me. I'll see you live.
All right, let's get into it. So, to understand the UFO phenomenon properly, it is necessary to return to the world of 1947. Remember, UFO Roswell crash. Not the mythological version that people remember today, but the actual historical environment in which this phenomenon emerged. The timing matters because UFOs did not appear during a stable period in human history. They appeared during one of the most psychologically volatile moments civilization had ever experienced. World War II had just ended. Europe was devastated. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had introduced atomic warfare to humanity. Millions were dead. Oh, lots of breath to rake up, huh? Governments had learned to operate through secrecy, compartmentalization, propaganda, and intelligence manipulation on a scale never seen before. Radar technology had transformed warfare. Jet aircrafts were becoming operational. Captured German scientists were being folded into the American military projects. The Soviet Union was rapidly becoming the next great threat, and the Cold War was beginning to form before the public even fully understood what it was. Well, that environment is critical because the UFO phenomenon was born directly inside that atmosphere of technological acceleration and strategic fear. Most people today think the UFO era began with Roswell. Historically, that is not quite accurate. The modern public explosion actually began with Kenneth Arnold in June of 1947. Arnold was not an anonymous civilian looking for attention. He was a pilot. While flying over Mount Rainier in Washington, he reported seeing a series of objects moving at extraordinary speeds across the sky. When reporters asked him to describe their movement, he compared it to a saucer skipping across water, just like this. Zoom, zoom, zoom. He saw, I think, like 5 or 6 of them. They just flew past him and then over the Mount Rainier. Well, the press simplified the phrase, and suddenly the term flying saucer was born. Well, that moment changed everything. Within, he could have been just high on mushrooms. Probably not. Within days, newspapers across America were flooded with sightings. The public imagination ignited almost instantly. Reports poured in from civilians, police officers, military personnel, and pilots. Some sightings were almost certainly misidentifications. Others were exaggerations. Some were likely psychological contagion amplified by nonstop headlines. But a similar percentage remained genuinely difficult to explain. And that distinction is important because the archives that I put together, they repeatedly show the same pattern. Most reports were weak, but a smaller number of cases involved credible observers and operational concern. Now, this is where the story becomes historically fascinating. The military did not simply laugh at the reports. That is one of the biggest misconceptions in modern UFO culture. The archives clearly show that military intelligence immediately became concerned about unexplained aerial phenomena. Not because they had proof of aliens, but because in 1947, the United States had entered a world where unidentified objects in restricted airspace represented a potential national security problem. The Cold War transformed uncertainty itself into a threat. And imagine the mindset of military leaders at that time. Radar systems were still developing. Long-range bombers capable of carrying nuclear weapons were becoming a reality. And intelligence agencies feared Soviet espionage and technological breakthroughs. Well, the United States had just witnessed how quickly secret projects like the Manhattan Project could change warfare forever. Nobody wanted to be surprised again, and that is why the archives repeatedly show intelligence routing, witness interviews, radar discussions, and classified memorandums appearing almost immediately after the first sightings. The government's concern was operational first, extraterrestrial second. That distinction changes the entire narrative. The Roswell incident is a perfect example of how uncertainty began multiplying instead of resolving. In 1947, in July, the Roswell Army Air Force announced that it had recovered a flying disc. Then almost immediately the story changed. Officials stated the object was merely a weather balloon. Decades afterward, explanation shifted again toward Project Mogul, balloon systems connected to nuclear detection programs. Well, regardless of what Roswell ultimately was, the damage to public trust had already been done. The contradiction itself became historically important. People began asking dangerous questions. If the military could change its story within 24 hours, what else could be hidden? If advanced classified objects existed beyond public awareness, how would civilians distinguish between secret technology and unexplained phenomena? And if the government truly did not know what certain objects were, how much uncertainty existed behind the scenes? Well, those questions created the psychological conditions necessary for conspiracy culture to emerge. And this is one of the most important realizations in the entire archive. The UFO phenomenon grew strongest wherever uncertainty remained unresolved. Not proof, uncertainty. And that pattern repeats constantly throughout the historical record. Another important factor, often ignored today, is how quickly media amplification transformed the phenomenon into a national obsession. Newspapers competed aggressively for attention. Radio personalities discussed sightings constantly. Sensational headlines spread faster than careful investigation. And once the phrase flying saucer entered public consciousness, every unexplained light in the sky suddenly acquired symbolic meaning. Well, the media did not merely report on the phenomena. It became part of the phenomenon itself. And that is historically massive because modern audiences often assume psychological amplification only become dangerous during the internet era. But the UFO archives show that large-scale narrative contagion was already functioning by 1947 through newspapers and radio alone. So at the same time, intelligence agencies were already beginning to understand the dangers of false positives. The archives repeatedly show investigators worrying about ordinary objects being misidentified as extraordinary craft. Reflections, meteors, balloons, atmospheric distortions, experimental aircraft, and optical illusions, they all became part of the investigative process. And that concern mattered because military defense systems depend on accurate identification. A civilian or a civilization operating under the nuclear anxiety cannot afford widespread confusion in the skies. So this is where the deeper historical significance of the UFO phenomenon begins to emerge. This is a psychological warfare thing, guys. So the issue was not merely, do aliens exist? The issue was that modern civilization had entered an era where technology moved faster than public understanding. Governments possessed classified systems civilians could not see. Radar detected objects humans could not visually identify. The atomic age introduced fears beyond ordinary human experience. Intelligence agencies operated through secrecy, and the public increasingly realized it could no longer independently verify what was happening above its own head. So that realization destabilized trust itself. And once trust begins eroding, mythology grows rapidly. This is why we got your Alice Bailey's, New Age alien teachings of the star gods are out there fighting the draconians. That's mythology, guys. This is why the UFO phenomenon expanded so quickly after 1947. It was not simply about sightings. It was about the collision between secrecy, technology, fear, and uncertainty during the birth of the modern national security state. The archives repeatedly show governments attempting to build systems capable of managing that uncertainty. Reporting procedures emerged, intelligence routing channels formed, witness credibility framework developed, radar integration became increasingly important. The military sought ways to separate noise from signal because the skies themselves had become strategically ambiguous. And guys, that phrase may ultimately define the entire UFO era better than any other. Strategic ambiguity. Because the phenomenon thrived inside the space between certainty and ignorance. Governments did not fully know, civilians did not fully trust, the media amplified everything, and the public's imagination rushed to fill in the gaps. So the process was never truly stopped. In many ways, the modern information age was already beginning in 1947. So the UFO phenomenon became one of the first large-scale examples of a civilization attempting to navigate unresolved uncertainty while surrounded by accelerating technology, institutional secrecy, media amplification, and psychological fear. And the consequences of that transformation are still unfolding today. So by the end of 1947, something extremely important had already happened behind the scenes. The United States military realized the UFO phenomenon was not disappearing, meaning we're filling in reports. Every strange plane that we see, it's a UFO. Well, that mattered because the original assumption inside much of government was likely that the flying saucer craze would burn itself out as public excitement faded. Instead, reports continued arriving from pilots, radar operators, civilians, police officers, military personnel, and intelligence channels all across the country. Some cases were weak and easily explained, while others remained difficult enough that they could not simply be ignored. This is where the archive becomes historically fascinating. Rather than proving extraterrestrials, the government began constructing something far more concrete, a system for managing aerial uncertainty itself. Well, that distinction changes everything. One of the most important documents in the archive is the Air Intelligence Requirements Memorandum concerning unconventional aircraft. Well, the language alone is revealing. The Air Force did not officially categorize the phenomenon as alien spacecraft. It framed the issue through military and intelligence terminology, unconventional aerial objects operating within strategically sensitive airspace. Well, that wording matters enormously. From the military perspective, the greatest danger was not necessarily extraterrestrials. The greatest danger was encountering unknown aerial phenomena during the opening years of the Cold War without reliable methods to classify them. So imagine the pressure inside the national security structure at that time. The Soviet Union was rapidly advancing technology. Atomic weapons had already altered the balance of civilization. Long-range bombers capable of nuclear delivery were becoming central to military planning. And radar systems were still evolving. Experimental aircraft programs were expanding under intense secrecy. and military had every reason to fear surprise breakthroughs by foreign powers. So inside that environment, unidentified objects in the sky became operational problems first and mysteries second. The archives clearly show the Air Force responding with structured investigative systems rather than emotional conclusions. The memorandums instructed personnel to document precise details surrounding sightings: date, time, altitude, speed, shape, conditions, observer location, radar confirmation, photographs, physical traces, and a witness reliability. That's me signing. This is critical historically because it proves the military approached the phenomenon through analytical filtration rather than immediate belief. So the system itself reveals the government's mindset there. The Air Force was not attempting to prove aliens existed. It was attempting to separate categories: misidentifications, atmospheric events, experimental aircraft, foreign technology, psychological contamination, fraud, and genuinely unresolved cases. Well, that distinction is one of the biggest revelations in the entire archive. Now, the military repeatedly attempted conventional explanations at first. Investigators considered meteors, balloons, planetary objects, reflections, optical illusions, aircraft lights, temperature inversions, and atmospheric distortions. Swamp gas. The archives show ongoing concern about the false positives contaminating report systems. That's important. Now, that concern was serious because false positives inside a nuclear age defense system could become catastrophic. An unexplained radar target was not merely a curiosity in 1949. It could represent enemy reconnaissance, technological infiltration, weapons testing, or strategic vulnerability. This is where the UFO phenomenon intersects directly with the rise of the national security state. Yeah, Philip, Trump said he released the UFO files. He released them yesterday, and it's a big pile of shit. The military responses reveal that governments feared ambiguity itself. Uncertainty inside strategic systems become destabilizing because modern defense structures depend upon accurate classification. And the archives repeatedly show investigators trying to reduce uncertainty mathematically, procedurally, and institutionally. That is why witness credibility became so important. One of the most sophisticated aspects of the Air Force procedures involved evaluating observers themselves. Investigators documented aviation experience, psychological conditioning, visual estimation ability, astronomical knowledge, fatigue, emotional stability, and technical expertise. Well, that is incredibly revealing. The military already understood that perception could become contamination by expectation, fear, excitement, and misunderstanding. And again, this was not irrational belief. It was structured intelligence analysis. And yet, despite these filtering systems, certain cases continued surviving that scrutiny. And that is where the phenomenon becomes institutionally difficult. The strongest cases in the archive rarely involve random anonymous civilians alone, but the most operationally significant reports often come from pilots, radar operators, police officers, military observers, airfield personnel, and trained aviation witnesses. But this does not prove extraterrestrials. But it does explain why the military could not simply dismiss everything as hysteria. Another massive development during this period was interagency coordination. The archives show UFO-related information moving between the FBI, Air Force Intelligence, Naval Intelligence, Air Defense Command, and eventually the CIA. That coordination matters historically because it proves the issue entered formal intelligence infrastructure very early. But another important pattern emerges at the same time. The FBI increasingly attempts to distance itself from the primary investigative responsibility. They're trying to get out of it. I don't have anything to do with that. That's just how they're doing. Over and over and over again, the archives show Bureau officials redirecting UFO matters toward Air Force channels. That handoff is historically significant because many later conspiracy theories interpreted this transfer as evidence of hidden knowledge. Yet the archives suggest a more complicated explanation. They don't know what it is, so they gave it to the Air Force. So the military possessed the technical systems relevant to the problem: radar, air defense, aviation, analysis, and strategic intelligence. The UFO issue naturally migrated toward the institutions best equipped to handle aerial uncertainty. But the secrecy surrounding military systems produced an unintended consequence. Public distrust began growing rapidly. And this is one of the deepest patterns visible throughout the archive. The more classified and compartmentalized military systems became, the more civilians suspected hidden truths existed beyond public awareness. Contradictory statements, withheld information, redirected inquiries, and incomplete explanations all amplified suspicion. So the irony is historically fascinating. The government's attempt to stabilize uncertainty may have unintentionally increased public mythology surrounding the phenomenon. Well, that mythology grew because unresolved ambiguity is psychologically powerful. Human beings naturally attempt to impose meaning onto unexplained patterns. And once uncertainty persists long enough, narratives rush to the vacuum. Meaning, if we don't know what it is, we're going to come up with a solution quick because we don't like uncertainty. Now, the archives repeatedly reveal that by the 1950s, the UFO phenomenon had already evolved beyond isolated aerial observations. It was becoming a psychological and cultural system through which people interpreted fears about secrecy, technology, hidden power, and the future of civilization itself. And this is also the period when radar becomes enormously important. The Air Force increasingly emphasized radar-confirmed events because visual sightings alone were insufficiently reliable. Instrument correlation mattered, and multi-sensor cases carried more weight than simple eyewitness testimony. Well, that distinction remains critical today. The archives repeatedly show the military attempting to move the phenomenon away from mythology and toward measurable data. Radar signatures, flight behavior, maneuverability, altitude estimates, electromagnetic interference, and physical trace evidence became central investigative priorities. Again, this does not prove extraterrestrial visitation. What it proves is that governments encountered enough unexplained aerial ambiguity to justify building long-term investigative and intelligence systems around it. So this may be one of the most important conclusions in the entire investigation, that the military did not create systems because it had certainty. It created systems because it lacked certainty. And that changes the entire historical framework. The UFO phenomenon became historically important not because governments publicly confirmed alien contact, but because modern military institutions suddenly discovered that they could not fully classify everything operating inside strategic airspace during the birth of the atomic age. And that realization transformed uncertainty itself into a national security problem. And once governments began managing uncertainty rather than resolving it, well, mythology inevitably expands around the gaps. So one of the most persistent patterns in the UFO archive is the repeated appearance of nuclear infrastructure. Again and again, the files return to the same locations: Oak Ridge, Los Alamos, and Sandia. White Sands, missile silos, atomic testing grounds, and strategic Air Force installations connected to nuclear defense systems. Well, that pattern is real, and it's all throughout the archives. But what that pattern means is where serious discipline becomes necessary. Because this is one of the areas where UFO mythology expanded far beyond what the evidence actually supports. The archives absolutely contain reports of unexplained aerial phenomena near nuclear-related facilities. FBI files discuss sightings around Oak Ridge. Military personnel documented unusual area observations near missile infrastructure. Green fireballs repeatedly appear near New Mexico installations tied to atomic research. And White Sands reports became associated with experimental missile testing and V-2 rocket programs. Well, those patterns exist historically. But another thing is equally important. The archives do not directly prove intentional extraterrestrial targeting of nuclear weapons facilities. And that distinction matters enormously. Most UFO documentaries immediately jump from sightings occurred near nuclear sites to aliens were monitoring humanity's nuclear development. Well, the archives do not establish that conclusion. Sorry. What they do establish is a correlation, and correlation is not causation. That is one of the most important intellectual boundaries in this entire investigation. Still, the nuclear connection remains historically fascinating because of the world these reports emerged from. The atomic age transformed civilization psychologically. Before Hiroshima and Nagasaki, humanity feared war. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, humanity feared extinction. That changes human consciousness permanently. The sudden realization that civilization could be destroyed or could destroy itself introduced a level of existential anxiety unlike anything humanity had experienced before. Nuclear weapons represented a visible power operating beyond ordinary comprehension. Radiation itself could not be seen. Atomic technology appeared almost supernatural to the public imagination. Well, that atmosphere matters because UFO mythology emerged directly inside that psychological environment. And nowhere was that environment more intense than in New Mexico. New Mexico, during the late 40s and early 50s, became one of the most technologically secretive regions on Earth. Los Alamos housed atomic research. White Sands conducted missile testing. Sandia became deeply connected to nuclear weapons systems, and captured German V-2 rockets were being studied and launched. Experimental aerospace technologies operated under extreme secrecy. So imagine being an ordinary civilian in that environment. Well, objects appear in the sky. Military testing increased. Explosions occurred in remote desert regions. Radar systems evolved rapidly, and aircraft capabilities changed almost yearly. Classified operations became common, and the government refused to explain many of the programs publicly. So the environment naturally generates uncertainty, and uncertainty naturally generates myth or mythology. One of the most famous examples from the archives involves the so-called green fireballs observed repeatedly over New Mexico beginning in the late 1940s. Scientists, military personnel, and pilots reported strange green luminous objects moving through the sky in ways some observers believed were inconsistent with ordinary meteors. Dr. Lincoln LaPaz became heavily involved in investigating these events. The details matter because LaPaz was not a random sensationalist. He was a respected astronomer and meteor expert. The military took the reports seriously enough to initiate formal analysis. But even here, the archives remain disciplined rather than conclusive. The files support repeated observations and scientific concern. They support military interest. They support the geographical overlap with sensitive installations. What they do not support is definitive proof of extraterrestrial craft monitoring atomic facilities. That distinction remains critical. The same pattern appears again in White Sands missile range reports. Some accounts describe unusual aerial observations occurring during a near missile test. Later mythology transformed these reports into claims that UFOs intentionally interfered with military rockets. Again, the archives require careful separation between evidence and interpretation. The files contain reports, the files contain witness concerns, and the files contain institutional interest, but they do not conclusively establish intentional interference by non-human intelligence. So Trump didn't release any of that. Boo-hoo. Still, another important reality emerges here. The military repeatedly treated unexplained aerial activity near strategic infrastructure more seriously than ordinary civilian sightings. That makes complete sense historically, right? And this is a common sense kind of a show. Now, nuclear facilities represented the most sensitive infrastructure in the world. Missile sites represented national survival. Strategic airspace could not be treated casually during the Cold War, and any unexplained object near those environments automatically triggered elevated concern. Again, this does not require extraterrestrials to explain the seriousness of the response. Strategic ambiguity alone was enough. And this is where the deeper historical significance begins emerging. The UFO phenomenon became psychologically linked to nuclear anxiety because both represented forms of invisible existential uncertainty. People feared atomic destruction they could not control. People feared hidden technologies they could not understand. And people feared institutions operating beyond public oversight. And the symbolism merged naturally. And this may explain why nuclear infrastructure became such powerful territory within UFO mythology itself. These locations already carried enormous psychological weight before UFO reports even appeared around them. Oak Ridge is a perfect example. The FBI archives contain files discussing sightings near the Oak Ridge area. Photographs were preserved. Reports were routed through internal security channels. That fact alone became enormously important culturally. Not necessarily because the photographs proved extraordinary craft, but because the government archived the material within the security framework connected to atomic infrastructure. That distinction shaped public interpretation. The institutional reaction itself became part of the mythology. And this is one of the most deepest reoccurring patterns here. Throughout the entire archive, the government concern amplified public suspicion, and public suspicion amplified mythology. So over time, the narrative evolved far beyond the original reports. By the 60s, 70s, UFO researchers increasingly argued that extraterrestrials were specifically monitoring humanity's nuclear capability. Missile silo incidents became central to this belief system. Former military witness later described strange aerial objects near Minuteman facilities. Stories emerged about temporary missile malfunctions occurring during unusual sightings. And some of these witnesses appear sincere. Some cases remain difficult to fully explain. Some instances involve credible military personnel. But once again, the archive stops short of definitive extraterrestrial confirmation. And this is where intellectual discipline matters most. The evidence supports repeated reports near strategic infrastructure, military concerns, witness testimony, and long-term institutional interest. The evidence does not yet support confirmed extraterrestrial intervention, intentional disarmament operations, or proven alien monitoring programs. And that gap matters enormously, because human beings are pattern recognition creatures. Once emotionally charged themes begin clustering together: nuclear weapons, secrecy, military installations, unexplained objects, classified programs, civilizations naturally begin constructing larger narratives around those correlations. Well, it's got to be Zeus and Apollo. And sometimes those narratives become more culturally powerful than the underlying evidence itself. Now, this may be one of the most important realizations in the entire UFO archive. The nuclear connection reveals less about extraterrestrials and more about the psychology of modern civilization under existential technological pressure. The atomic age forced humanity into a permanent state of uncertainty about its own future. UFO mythology grew inside that uncertainty and attached itself to the most emotionally charged symbols of the era: nuclear weapons, hidden power, government secrecy, and technological forces operating beyond public understanding. Now, in that sense, the UFO phenomena became a mirror reflecting the fears of a civilization that suddenly realized it possessed the power to destroy itself. And once that realization entered human consciousness, the mythology surrounding the skies was never going to disappear. Now we've got draconians, we've got 4-foot-tall grays, we've got 8-foot-tall Nordics. Here we go. By the early 1950s, something extremely important happened to the UFO phenomenon. It was no longer simply a collection of unexplained sightings. It had become a media ecosystem, and that distinction changed everything. The archives repeatedly show that the growth of UFO culture cannot be separated from the growth of mass communication itself. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, magazines, television programs, and later civilian UFO newsletters transformed isolated incidences into continuous national conversation. And once that process begins, the phenomenon started feeding itself. And this is one of the most important historical realizations in the entire investigation. The media became part of the phenomenon itself. Yes, they did. That matters because unresolved stories spread differently than resolved ones. Human beings are naturally drawn toward mystery, especially when institutions appear uncertain or contradictory. A fully explained event dies quickly in public consciousness. An unresolved event expands. So the UFO phenomenon thrived inside unresolved ambiguity. And every contradictory military statement, every unexplained radar report, every sensational newspaper headline, and every leaked rumor increased public fascination. And once the phrase flying saucer entered American culture, people began interpreting ordinary events through an entirely new psychological framework. Well, that process accelerated rapidly, and the archive shows newspapers competing aggressively for UFO stories because public interest exploded almost overnight. Headlines about mysterious discs, military encounters, and strange lights sold papers. Radio hosts discussed sightings constantly. Television eventually amplified the imagery even further. And every new report reinforced the perception that something enormous might be happening behind the scenes. And the more uncertainty remained, the larger the mythology grew. So one of the deepest patterns visible in the archive is that the strongest cultural reactions often emerged not from the best evidence, but from the great ambiguity.
Why do 75% of people feel exhausted all the time? The answer might surprise you. In the 1920s, Standard Oil decided to dive into medicine. They pushed synthetic petroleum into our drugs. Sure, it masked symptoms, but it wrecked our guts. Our good bacteria, which fight off parasites and heavy metals, got wiped out by crude oil. But here's the good news. We can fix this by going back to nature. Introducing Elite Potion, the world's top detox program. It restores your good bacteria by removing toxic threats like aluminum, strontium, barium, and parasites. Imagine feeling energized and alive again. They said there couldn't be a pill that did it all. We invented it. Visit elitepotion.com and reclaim your health from synthetic pharmaceuticals. Your body will thank you.
Roswell is the perfect example. The event at Roswell itself may have been relatively limited historically compared to later mythology, but the contradictory statements surrounding Roswell became psychologically explosive. The military announced the military announced the recovery of a flying disc and then rapidly changed the explanation. Well, decades later, additional explanations involving classified balloon systems emerged. And that contradiction created something far more powerful than just uncertainty. It created suspicion. And I think it was done on purpose. But it can't prove it. And the suspicion spreads culturally much faster than resolution. And this is where the UFO phenomenon began evolving into a permanent distrust framework. The archives repeatedly show civilians asking the same questions. If the government changed the story once, what else might it hide? If classified projects existed beyond public awareness, how could ordinary people distinguish secret technology from unexplained phenomena? And if intelligence agencies were compartmentalized, who truly knew what was happening? Well, those questions became the fuel for modern UFO culture. And again, this does not require a coordinated conspiracy to explain the effect. Institutional secrecy alone was enough, and the Cold War intensified this dramatically. Governments across the world operated through secrecy, intelligence compartmentalization, classified aerospace programs, and psychological warfare systems. The public knew these programs existed even if they could not see them directly, and that realization fundamentally changed how people interpret uncertainty. So modern civilization was entering an era where ordinary citizens increasingly understood that powerful institutions possessed hidden technologies, classified information, and operational capabilities beyond public visibility. And that realization became psychologically destabilizing. The UFO phenomena attached itself directly to that instability, and the media amplified it constantly. And another important pattern appears throughout the archives. Media coverage itself influenced sighting waves. After major UFO headlines appeared, reports surged dramatically. And this does not necessarily mean witnesses were lying. It means attention alters perception. And once societies become primed to interpret unusual aerial events through a UFO network, more reports naturally emerged. And this is one reason the archives repeatedly show concern about the mass contagion and public hysteria. Intelligence agencies and military officials increasingly worried that the phenomenon could overwhelm reporting systems with unreliable information. And the greatest fear was often not extraterrestrials. The greatest fear was informational instability. And this is one of the most misunderstood aspects of the entire UFOs era. The Robertson panel later addressed this directly. Intelligence officials worried that massive public fascination with UFOs could overload communication systems, interfere with defense readiness, and create vulnerabilities during periods of national tension. Well, that concern may sound strange today, but it made complete sense inside the Cold War logic. If radar systems, military communication channels, newspapers, and public attention became saturated with uncertain aerial reports during a geopolitical crisis, the potential for confusion increased dramatically. So the archives repeatedly show governments attempting to reduce uncertainty while the media continuously amplified it. So that tension became self-sustaining. And at the same time, civilian UFO organizations began emerging rapidly. Groups dedicated to collecting sightings, publishing reports, organizing conferences, and investigating government secrecy expanded across the country. Once organizations formed, the phenomenon acquired institutional memory outside government control. That was historically massive because now UFO culture no longer depended entirely on individual sightings. It possessed newsletters, conferences, investigators, archives, celebrity researchers, and communities built all around the shared belief system. So the phenomenon became social. And once something becomes socially embedded, it evolves beyond evidence alone. The archives reveal another critical development during this period, the emergence of alternative information networks. Civilian researchers increasingly believed mainstream institutions could not be trusted to tell the full truth. As distrust expanded, independent UFO publications gained influence. And that pattern should sound familiar today. Alternative media ecosystems often emerge where institutional trust declines. Well, that's happening right now. Nobody trusts CNN, NBC, ABC, EFG, Fox. The UFO era may have been one of the earliest modern examples of this process unfolding at a national scale. And people sought information outside official channels because uncertainty remained unresolved. This means every gap in explanation became fertile territory for speculation, mythology, and identity formation. And over time, the mythology itself became more culturally powerful than the original sightings themselves. This is one of the deepest conclusions emerging from the archive, that the UFO phenomenon expanded because it became psychologically useful to modern civilization. It gave people a framework through which they could process fear of nuclear annihilation, fear of hidden power, fear of technological acceleration, fear of institutional deception, and fear of reality itself was becoming increasingly difficult to interpret. The media ecosystem amplified all of it. Way to go, media. Another important realization appears repeatedly throughout the historical record. Emotionally charged narratives spread faster than disciplined analysis. A radar anomaly described carefully by military investigators generates limited public interest. A dramatic headline claiming mysterious craft violated military airspace spreads instantly. Human attention naturally gravitates toward emotionally loaded uncertainty. So the archives show this process operating constantly. And once television enters the equation, the phenomenon intensified even further. Visual media transformed UFOs into permanent cultural imagery. Flying discs, glowing lights, military secrecy, crashed craft, and mysterious beings became embedded inside entertainment, science fiction, and public imagination all at once. Well, the line between investigation and mythology began blurring. This is where the UFO phenomenon truly became larger than the sightings themselves. And guys, this may be one of the most important lessons for modern audiences. Civilizations do not require definitive proof for narratives to become socially real. Ambiguity alone can reshape culture if uncertainty is amplified long enough through media, fear, repetition, and institutional distrust. And that is exactly what's happening during the UFO era. And the same mechanisms now dominate the digital age. Social media, algorithmic amplification, AI-generated content, deepfakes, psychological operations, and fragmented information ecosystems all operate through similar dynamics as modern societies increasingly struggle to distinguish between evidence, interpretation, emotion, and amplification. The UFO phenomenon may have been the first major modern rehearsal for this condition, because once civilization loses confidence in its ability to independently verify reality, mythology inevitably rushes into the gaps. It's got to be Zeus, Apollo, it's got to be God. And those mythologies can become more powerful than the original events themselves. So by the mid-50s, the UFO phenomenon underwent another major transformation. It stopped being only a mystery about objects in the sky and started becoming something spiritual. And this was one of the most important turning points in the entire history of the UFO culture, because once the phenomenon entered religion, mysticism, and metaphysical belief systems, it became far more emotionally powerful than simple aerial sightings that could have been. The archives clearly show this transition happening in real time. Early UFO reports focused mostly on strange craft, unusual movement, military concern, and unexplained aerial observations. But as certainty continued unresolved year after year, people began searching for deeper meaning inside the mystery itself. And that is where the contactee era emerged. It wasn't in the 40s, it was in the 50s. The contactees were very different from the military witnesses and radar operators and that dominated earlier reports. These individuals claimed not merely to observe strange objects, but to communicate directly with beings associated with them. What is fascinating historically is that their messages often reflected the fears and hopes of the atomic age itself. This matters enormously because the phenomenon was now evolving from observation into interpretation. And interpretation changes everything. Figures like George Adamski, George von Tassel, Truman Bethlehem, George Hunt Williamson, and others became central voices in this new movement. Their stories varied in detail, but common themes repeatedly, constantly. Advanced beings warning humanity about nuclear war, higher civilization, concerns about Earth's violence, and hidden wisdom beyond human understanding, spiritual evolution, telepathy, cosmic brotherhood, and salvation through enlightenment. Do you catch what I'm getting at, guys? Those themes were not random. They reflected the psychological condition of the post-war world. Humanity had entered the atomic era, terrified of annihilation, and traditional institutions increasingly appeared incapable of preventing global destruction. Governments operated through secrecy, the Cold War intensified paranoia, technological acceleration outpaced emotional stability, so people feared both the future and the systems governing it. And inside that environment, the contactee movement offered something emotionally powerful: meaning. Meaning, just meaning. That may be one of the most important realizations in the entire UFO archive. The contactee phenomenon functioned less like a scientific investigation, more like religious adaptation to technological civilization. And that distinction matters enormously, as many contactee narratives followed structures remarkably similar to older spiritual traditions: chosen messengers, higher beings, warnings to humanity, hidden knowledge, moral purification, apocalyptic danger, and promises of transformation. Meaning, there's nothing new under the sun. This is why Carl Jung later described flying saucers as a kind of modern myth. He understood that the UFO phenomenon was operating psychologically and symbolically, not merely physically. The archive strongly supports that interpretation. Now, as the contactee movement expanded, UFOs increasingly became vessels into which many people projected spiritual longing, existential anxiety, and hope for transcendence. You know, we're gonna vibrate into heaven. Well, that evolution is historically massive because once the phenomenon became spiritually meaningful, it no longer depended entirely on evidence. Belief systems rarely operate through evidence alone. They operate through emotional resonance, identity formation, symbolism, community, and meaning. The archives show this transition clearly. Flying saucer conventions emerged. Civilian organizations expanded rapidly. Publications circulated stories of cosmic beings and hidden technologies. Channeling movements developed. Some groups blended UFOs with ancient civilizations, occult traditions, Eastern mysticism, or apocalyptic prophecy. Well, the phenomenon became increasingly metaphysical. And again, this transformation occurred during a period when modern civilization was struggling psychologically with technological acceleration and institutional distrust. That connection is very critical as the contactee movement emerged at the same time. Television culture exploded, nuclear anxiety intensified, and science fiction entered mainstream entertainment. So humanity was beginning to imagine futures beyond Earth while simultaneously fearing destruction on Earth. And those contradictory emotions merged inside the UFO phenomenon. Another important pattern appears repeatedly throughout the archive. The farther the phenomenon moved from direct observation and into spiritual interpretation, the more difficult it became to separate sincere belief from mythology. Some contactees likely believed deeply in what they were describing. Others may have exaggerated stories consciously. Some may have experienced psychological projection, altered states, fantasy proneness, or social reinforcement. But historically, the truth of the experiences mattered less than the cultural effects that they produced. And that is one of the deepest lessons inside this archive. Mythologies become powerful when they provide frameworks through which societies process fear and uncertainty. The UFO contactee movement provided exactly that. It transformed unexplained aerial ambiguity into a spiritual narrative about humanity's future. Notice how the themes evolved. Early military concern focused on airspace, radar, classification, and strategic defense. The contactee movement focused on consciousness, human evolution, peace, higher intelligence, and cosmic destiny. The phenomena was becoming psychologically adaptive. And this is also where the UFO issue begins separating into multiple parallel worlds. One world remained grounded in the military investigation, radar events, pilot sightings, and intelligence analysis. A whole other world evolved into spiritual cosmology and metaphysical interpretation. You know, like the space aliens are... Dude, there are people. I'm not making fun of them. They really believe it, but they really believe that there's an intergalactic union of space people meeting at the rings of Saturn, going over all the problems with Earth with other aliens, saying that there's good ETs and bad ETs. And all of that happened because the military was keeping secrets, experimenting with nuclear fusion and fission and all kinds of ways of producing energy from nothing, which would produce strange lights. And all of that, the military said, you know, we could keep this even more secret if we released to the public in 1947 that it was a UFO and then retract it like, oh God, we got in trouble. Because look what happened. Now we're all insane. Another world evolved into spiritual cosmology and metaphysical interpretation, and those two worlds increasingly overlapped while operating according to completely different standards of evidence. Now, I've read many books of the Dark Ages, and none of them talked about intergalactic beings that were worried about the war and, you know, in Europe. It just came from the 50s. So that split still exists today. The UFO phenomenon survived because it became flexible enough to absorb nearly every major anxiety and hope of the modern age. People projected into it fear of nuclear annihilation, fear of hidden government power, fear of technological control, hope for salvation, hope for higher intelligence, hope for transcendence, and longing for meaning inside an increasingly mechanized civilization. The phenomenon became emotionally useful, and that is why it continued expanding, even when definitive proof remained elusive. Another fascinating aspect of the contactee era is how often advanced beings were portrayed not as conquerors, but as moral observers. Many stories described extraterrestrials as deeply concerned about humanity's spiritual and ethical condition. Again, this mirrors older religious structures almost perfectly. The cosmic beings often function symbolically as externalized moral authority figures watching civilization from above. That symbolism mattered because post-war society increasingly feared that humanity's technological power had surpassed its moral maturity. The UFO phenomenon became a container for that fear. And this is also where hidden technology narratives began expanding rapidly. Contactees often claimed advanced civilizations possessed limitless energy systems, anti-gravity propulsion, healing technologies, or knowledge intentionally withheld from humanity. Well, those ideas later evolved into massive subcultures involving free energy, suppressed inventions, breakaway civilizations, secret space programs, and hidden scientific revolutions. But again, the archives repeatedly show these narratives expanded far beyond direct evidence alone. The mythology itself became self-sustaining, and once communities form around emotionally meaningful uncertainty, the system grows independently of the original phenomenon. And this is why UFO culture increasingly resembles religion, alternative spirituality, and identity formation more than traditional scientific inquiry. It provided people with community meaning, shared symbols, hidden knowledge, and explanations for a rapidly changing world. That may explain why the phenomenon became so resilient culturally, because civilizations undergoing rapid technological transformation often generate new mythologies to help people psychologically process uncertainty. So the UFO contactee movement may have been one of the first large-scale examples of this process unfolding in the modern technological age, and in many ways, those dynamics have only intensified since then. So in the early 1950s, the United States government had reached an uncomfortable realization. The UFO phenomenon was no longer just a collection of isolated sightings. It had become a national psychological issue. Military agencies worried about radar confusion, intelligence overload, and public panic. Civilian UFO organizations were expanding rapidly. Newspapers amplified every major sighting wave. Radio programs discussed mysterious aerial objects constantly, and public fascination showed no signs of slowing down. Inside that environment, intelligence officials began asking a very different question. The question was no longer simply, what are those objects? The question became, what effect is this phenomenon having on society itself? Well, that shift is one of the most important turning points in this entire archive. The Robertson panel emerged directly from that concern. In 1953, the CIA assembled a scientific advisory board led by the physicist H.P. Robertson to evaluate the UFO problem. The panel reviewed military reports, radar cases, photographs, films, and intelligence summaries related to flying saucers. But the deeper significance of the Robertson panel was not merely its conclusions about UFOs. The deeper significance was that intelligence agencies were now openly analyzing the social and psychological consequences of mass UFO belief. And that distinction changes everything. The archives show the panel was deeply concerned about the possibility that public fascination with UFOs could interfere with national security systems. The Cold War was intensifying. Intelligence officials feared communication overload, false reporting during emergencies, and public vulnerability to manipulation. So large numbers of unreliable UFO reports could potentially clog military communication channels during moments of strategic tension. Radar operators and defense personnel already operated inside a world of uncertainty, and intelligence agencies feared that mass fascination with unexplained aerial phenomena could amplify confusion during a crisis. Now again, the greatest fear was not the extraterrestrials. The greatest fear was instability. Our heads. This is where the archive becomes historically profound, because the Robertson panel reveals something essential about modern governments. States fear uncontrolled uncertainty because uncertainty weakens centralized interpretation. If populations begin constructing their own explanations for unexplained events outside official channels, then governments lose narrative stability. And that concern appears repeatedly throughout this archive. The Robertson panel recommended reducing public fascination with UFOs through debunking and educational campaigns. This point is critical because many later conspiracy theories interpreted the panel as proof of a massive cover-up operation. But the archives support a more nuanced reality. Intelligence officials appear to have viewed the UFO phenomena less as confirmed extraterrestrial activity and more as a growing psychological and informational problem. That distinction matters enormously. The panel worried that civilian UFO organizations could unintentionally become vulnerable to manipulation by hostile actors. Cold War intelligence agencies constantly feared infiltration, disinformation, and psychological warfare. And from their perspective, large decentralized belief networks built around uncertainty represented potential security risks. And again, this does not require extraterrestrials to explain the concern. It only requires governments operating under Cold War paranoia. And it worked. The archives also reveal another fascinating reality. Ridicule itself became institutional policy. The Robertson panel recommended reducing the seriousness of which UFOs were perceived publicly. This included encouraging media outlets, scientists, educators, and public institutions to frame the phenomenon in less alarming ways. Over time, this contributed to the strange cultural split that still exists today. Publicly, UFOs became associated with ridicule, tabloid sensationalism, and fringe culture. Privately, military and intelligence systems continued monitoring unexplained aerial events. So that contradiction became historically explosive because once people realized serious realized serious military investigations existed behind the scenes while public ridicule dominated mainstream culture, distrust intensified dramatically. Many civilizations concluded that the government must be hiding something extraordinary. In reality, the archives suggest a more complicated dynamic, that governments were attempting to reduce public instability while continuing to investigate unresolved aerial uncertainty internally. So the irony is profound. Efforts to suppress public fascination may have unintentionally increased conspiracy culture instead. And this is one of the deepest patterns visible throughout the entire archive. Institutional secrecy combined with public ridicule often amplifies suspicion rather than eliminating it. Human beings naturally distrust systems that appear contradictory. If governments publicly dismiss a subject while privately investigating it, people instinctively assume hidden motives exist. And then therefore, we all jump to aliens. So the UFO phenomenon thrived inside those contradictions. And another critical aspect of the Robertson panel era was the growing awareness of psychological contagion. Intelligence of it, I fell for it too. Until I started just keeping my head in my Bible. Intelligence officials increasingly recognize that mass attention influences perception itself. Once societies become emotionally primed to interpret ambiguous stimuli through a UFO framework, reporting waves naturally increase. And this concern appears repeatedly throughout military and intelligence discussions. Again, this does not necessarily mean witnesses were lying. It means perception is shaped by cultural expectation. And that insight is profoundly important because it connects the UFO era directly to modern information warfare and media psychology. Today, social media algorithms amplify emotional uncertainty constantly. Viral narratives spread faster than careful investigation. Public perception becomes fragmented, institutions struggle to maintain credibility, and populations increasingly distrust centralized authority while simultaneously depending upon centralized systems for interpretation. So the archive suggests that governments were already confronting primitive versions of these same problem during the UFO era. And that realization changes the historical significance of the entire phenomenon. The Robertson panel may not represent proof of extraterrestrial cover-ups. It may instead represent one of the earliest major attempts by modern intelligence systems to manage large-scale informational uncertainty inside technologically advanced societies. So that possibility is enormous. The archives repeatedly show intelligence agencies worrying about how people react to unresolved ambiguity. UFOs become a perfect testing ground for this problem because the phenomenon combined technological fear, military secrecy, media amplification, and psychological projection, and institutional distrust. Once all of those elements merge together, stable public interpretations become difficult. This may be one of the most important lessons emerging from this entire investigation. Modern societies are highly vulnerable when uncertainty becomes emotionally amplified faster than institutions can explain it. The Robertson panel existed because governments recognized that danger very early. Another important point often ignored in modern UFO discussions is that the panel did not claim all sightings were fraudulent. The archives show investigators continuing to acknowledge that some cases remain unexplained, even after analysis. Unexplained. The nuance matters enormously because many people falsely assume the government either completely dismissed the phenomenon or completely confirmed it. Remember, we all think that they have aliens in Wright-Patterson Base underground, chilled on ice. The reality appears far more complicated. Governments encountered persistent ambiguity and attempted to manage its social consequences while continuing technical investigations internally. Well, that framework fits the archives far better than simplistic narratives about either total disclosure or total fabrication. And this is also where the UFO phenomenon begins connecting directly to broader systems of perception management. Once governments recognize that public belief itself can become strategically significant, controlling emotional interpretations becomes almost as important as controlling physical information. And that dynamic exists everywhere in modern civilization now. Media systems shape emotional framing, governments manage public messaging during crisis, and algorithms amplify emotionally charged narratives. Psychological operations target perception itself, and public attention becomes a strategic resource. Might I just say, all of this worked really well for the government to keep the secrets, of the crap that they're working on, like the tic-tac, anti-gravity, and any other stuff that they're not going to release right now because we don't need it, because it's decades ahead of the wars that we're fighting now. So the UFO era may have been one of the first modern examples of governments confronting these realities at scale. That may explain why the phenomenon became historically important far beyond the sightings themselves. The real issue was never only what people saw in the sky. The real issue became how civilization reacts when uncertainty spreads faster than trust. And hey, how do we not know that and this is just a conspiracy theory itself. How do we not know that the Canadian what are they called? Technology Society, the Technology, or Technocracy Inc., the Canadian Technocracy Inc. of the 1930s, when they all decided in Canada that the world needs to be run on an algorithm and not on a constitution. How do we know that it wasn't those Canadians who just literally merged in with America somehow? Because Elon Musk talks about Technocracy Inc. and that movement in the 30s. How do we know that they didn't use this as a psychological operation to get us to basically let go of our Constitution and get into the algorithm? And we don't even know if all of this was just bullshit reporting just to get that psychological ambiguity placed over us. I mean, seriously. Because what I've just said, and we've still got a long way to go, what I just said is very common sense explanations of what in the hell is going on. Release what? Okay, what did they have? All that was highly classified, and then after that's a nothing burger, because all along what they're really releasing, and that this is what the archives say, because if you use AI, you download all this alien bullshit that Trump put up there. It says this. This is what it says. It's psychological ambiguity to control the masses, and it worked. By the late 50s and early 60s, UFO phenomenon had evolved into something entirely different from what emerged from 1947. It was no longer dependent upon isolated sightings alone. It had become self-sustaining. And this is one of the most important transformations in the entire history of the phenomenon, because once UFO culture becomes socially embedded, it has no longer required constant, extraordinary evidence to continue expanding. They continued. So the system itself began generating momentum. Got big. And we all watched it. Did you all not watch Project Camelot with what's her name and what's his name? Bill and we would watch these whistleblowers talk about the government hiding shit. And just off of the report that was sent, all the information that was sent from Trump yesterday, it was all psychological bullshit. And we all fell for it. And the alien narrative could be used as a narrative because people are believing in their space masters, their higher consciousness self, as they trip on, literally, trip on mushrooms and to contact their space brothers. This is the simplest explanation. That this whole UFO crap, yeah, there were some things that they couldn't explain. They could not explain it. It's unexplained, meaning they don't know what it was, but it most definitely wasn't alien or them. They don't know. So the archives reveal this transition of what happened in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Dude, it went global. It multiplied rapidly across the United States and eventually internationally. And groups dedicated to collecting sightings, investigative government secrecy, publishing reports, organizing conferences, and building alternative information networks became increasingly influential. And the phenomenon developed its own infrastructure, and that development changed everything. So it wasn't merely about objects in the sky anymore. It was about identity, community, distrust of a centralized authority. I could go on and on and on. But I still have like literally two more. This is like so long. I need to conclude it because I'm tired. So by the time of the modern world entered the digital age, guys, the UFO phenomenon had already completed a transformation unlike almost any other cultural development of the 20th century. What began as isolated reports of unusual aerial objects during the opening years of the Cold War evolved into a permanent system of uncertainty woven directly into modern civilization itself. That transformation may ultimately be far more historically important than the sightings that originally triggered it, which probably were just swamp gas. And the deeper the archives are examined, the clearer the reality becomes. The UFO phenomenon survived not because definitive proof emerged, but because definitive resolution never arrived. Governments never fully explained every incident. They closed it up and called it secret on purpose. And civilian researchers never fully proved extraterrestrial visitation. Military investigations continued without achieving total clarity, and media amplification expanded faster than careful analysis. Thus, public distrust intensified faster than institutions could stabilize it. Thus, ambiguity became permanent. And that may be the single most important discovery in this entire investigation. There are no aliens. I'm sorry. There are demons. But dude, there's more evidence of ghosts than there are of extraterrestrials. I'm seeing more evidence of people capturing ghosts than ET. That's data. The phenomena became historically powerful because modern civilization entered an era where uncertainty itself could no longer be fully controlled. Algorithmic amplification, deepfakes, AI-generated content, psychological operations, narrative warfare, institutional distrust, fragmented information ecosystems, and population struggling to determine what is real. So what are we going to turn to? We're going to turn to intergalactic nice aliens. Well, the UFO phenomenon may have been one of the first modern examples of societies confronting large-scale unresolved ambiguity inside technologically advanced systems. And that realization changes everything. We needed an excuse to explain the phenomenon away of us experimenting with atomic energy, experimenting with anti-gravity, experimenting with anti-radar equipment. That's all they were experimenting with. You see, trying to create things so the radar can pick it up. So that they could tweak the radars. Because they don't know what the Russians were working on. They only got parts of it. And same thing with the Americans. During the Cold War, they were both working on exotic energy. And for decades, the governments attempted to stabilize and interpret through classified systems, investigative procedures, psychological management, media framing, and public debunking campaigns. And while they're doing that, civilian researchers attempted to bypass official narratives through independent investigation and alternative information networks. Thus, media systems amplified fear, fascination, and speculation simultaneously. And the result? It was not resolution. It was informational fragmentation. That's what we got. That's what we got. And I've always said, why would ET come now? Why now, when we can defend ourselves? Why now, when we can blow shit up with atomic weapons? Why now, when they can travel through wormholes and travel through space and time? Why now? Why not travel back when the gold is all out of the earth and placed in under the king's chair, or travel back 1,000,000 years from now. The gold's still there. I'm just saying, for resources. This phenomenon became emotionally adaptive. I was emotionally adaptive to it because I saw something and my brain needed to explain it away. And how I explained it away, guys, it was the only thing that made sense. And this may ultimately be the deepest conclusion of the entire archive, that the most important revelation may not be whether unidentified objects exist in the skies. Okay? The most important revelation may be that modern civilization discovered it no longer fully distinguished between observation, interpretation, amplification, and mythology once technological complexity surpassed ordinary human understanding. Doesn't that suck? So that realization permanently altered public trust. And the UFO era demonstrated how rapidly ambiguity can reshape civilization when combined with secrecy, fear, accelerating technology, and fragmented information systems. And what began as isolated reports of strange aerial phenomena and objects ultimately evolved into a mirror reflecting humanity's deepest anxieties about power, truth, perception, and control. And in many ways, that mirror may now define the modern age itself.
This has been Cause Before Symptom with your host, James Carner. Go to his website, jamescarner.com, and sign up for his newsletter. Also, download his free books on the breath war, the crown of blood, and the ritual machine. Fix your body by buying his award-winning detox formula, removing heavy metals and parasites. You'll feel better and live longer. Go to elitepotion.com. And one more thing, please. Just try and love your neighbor, because if you do, the world would be a better place. See you tomorrow.
Paying federal income tax is voluntary. So why has every person you know done it their entire lives? You were told it's the law. But the system was built on a lie hidden in plain sight, that you are required by law to pay. The truth is, 98% of Americans don't owe income tax by law. Federal income tax is for federal employees. For everyone else, it's voluntary. You agreed to pay when you signed your first tax return, and you've been renewing that contract every year since. Sounds too good to be true? You're asking, why doesn't everyone know this? Because almost everyone signed before they were old enough to understand it. It's time to unlearn the lie and break free from IRS jurisdictions, protect your assets, and keep more of what you earn legally. Visit unincorporatedassociations.com now and become tax-free.